Welcome Life Science learners to another installment. Trust that you guys are well and excited about our lesson today. In our lesson today, we're going to be revising human impact. It's important that we recognize that this section has been a section that we've looked at the various different concepts and components towards human impact on the environment. In our lesson today, we're going to overview some of those main concepts, and we're going to try and apply our understanding to solving some questions and applying that to different scenarios. So let's get straight into the lesson, have an overview of the main concepts, and then try and answer some questions based on the understanding of those concepts. Guys, it's important that in any section that we review the main concepts before we start revising. It's important that you have an overview of the important terms and create a vocab list, as I always mention. A list of all the important terms at the start of a section. We're going to spend some time overviewing the atmosphere and climate change, and then we're going to take some questions on that. So let's get straight into the first segment of our lesson today. As I mentioned, it's important that we recognize what are the core concepts in this topic. The core concepts are firstly, looking at human impact on the environment and the current crisis that we face. We know that the environment is crucial to our existence. The context of understanding this is what have humans done to the environment in terms of the impact that they've had. And let's look at that and then try and reflect on that as we go through this section. We got to recognize that the atmosphere and the climate has begun to change, and we must then look at the factors that have caused the change in the atmosphere and the climate. We also look at water availability and water quality and the human impact on water availability and the quality that we have. Food security is an important component of understanding human impact. We also look at the impact that humans have had on the loss of biodiversity. And finally, we're going to spend some time looking at solid waste removal and the techniques and procedures around effective solid waste management. Guys, it's important that we look at some key words, and these are essentially just to recap those main concepts that you've done. So the concept of atmosphere and the different gases that make up the atmosphere are important. We must know what climate change is and the factors or the impact that humans have had on climate change. We must know what the greenhouse effect is, what are the greenhouse gases, and how the enhanced greenhouse effect has occurred due to an increased amount of greenhouse gases produced by humans. We also need to look at what carbon dioxide emissions are and where these come from in terms of the industries. As I mentioned, the different greenhouse gases would include methane as well. The concept of carbon footprint is important, and if you recollect, we're looking at the impact that humans have on the environment and the amount of carbon dioxide produced by different factors or different activities that humans carry out. Global warming as a concept where humans have increased the greenhouse gases, increasing the average temperature on the earth, and that leading to the global warming and the effects that has on the environment. The concept of biodiversity is an important concept living in South Africa. We do recognize it's a country that is diverse in both plant and animals, and the concept of biodiversity is important. And what the impact that humans have had on biodiversity, such as desertification, where lands are becoming eroded and dry, deforestation, where we remove lots of trees. Let's have a main overview of the concept of greenhouse effect. And that's important because I see this as an important section and it's relevant and current to most examiners. The greenhouse effect is a natural process where the earth warms the surface, and we do know that the earth is generally warmed up by the sunlight that we get, and that's a natural phenomenon. We look at how the radiant energy from the sun warms up the atmosphere around us. When the sun's energy reaches the earth's atmosphere, some of it is reflected back to the space and the rest is absorbed, and it's re-radiated by the greenhouse gases. So we will illustrate that in an image soon. The absorbed energy warms the atmosphere and the surface of the earth. Let's look at that in an image. So guys, we do know that the greenhouse gases are gases that are present in this layer around the surface called the atmosphere. So we have the atmosphere made up of different gases that play an important part in terms of maintaining the temperature on Earth. As a natural phenomenon, the Earth receives sunlight from the sun. Lots of that energy is reflected off the surface and it's sent back into the atmosphere. We do know that some of it is then reflected back onto the surface of the Earth by the layer of atmosphere that we see. And that's a natural process. However, due to the increase in greenhouse gases, we find that this layer becomes significantly thicker and it becomes more a reflective surface, so more energy is reflected or heat is reflected back onto the surface of the Earth. And this enhanced reflection increases the average temperature on Earth. And so this is essentially the impact that humans have had by producing larger amounts of greenhouse gases. So the greenhouse effect is a natural phenomenon that takes place and keeps the temperature of the Earth constant. So as I mentioned, there are many greenhouse gases occur naturally in the atmosphere, such as carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, nitrous oxide, while others are synthetically produced through various industrial processes. Those that are man-made include your chlorofluorocarbons, your CFCs, which was predominantly used in your coolants and refrigerants back in the 1980s and 70s. Hydrofluorocarbons, your HFCs, your perfluorocarbons, your PFCs, as well as your sulfur hexafluorides. And so these are different types of man-made or synthetically produced greenhouse gases. Okay? The atmospheric concentration of both natural and man-made gases have begun rising over the last few centuries due to the Industrial Revolution. And so guys, when we track back these concentrations of the gases in the atmosphere, we have noticed that due to the Industrial Revolution, which has led to the development of industries and mechanization, lots of these industries produce large amounts of greenhouse gases. So the concentration of these greenhouse gases have increased. And so the main greenhouse gases are water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, ozone, nitrous oxide, as well as your chlorofluorocarbons. The enhanced greenhouse effect essentially points to the impact that humans have had by producing significantly more greenhouse gases. So let's see what has happened. So the disruption of the Earth's climate equilibrium, which is the balance, is caused by an increase in the concentration of the greenhouse gases. And this has led to an increase in the global average surface temperatures. So we know that the enhanced greenhouse effect is due to human impact, and that is an increase in the temperature of the surface of the Earth. And this is not significantly a lot, but it's often by a degree or two over 150 years. And that significant increase in the average global temperature has had significant and huge impact on the Earth's environment. Okay, so this process is called the enhanced greenhouse effect. So guys, as I mentioned, that this is the natural process where some of that heat is then released back onto the surface of the Earth. However, with increased greenhouse gases, we find that more of the radiation is reflected back onto the surface of the Earth, increasing the temperature and the average temperature around various parts of the world. And so a significant contributor to the greenhouse gases is carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide, we know, is produced by many industries. We also know that there are other gases like methane and nitrous oxide, which are also emitted. There are lots of these gases are produced by the use and the combustion of fossil fuels, as well as in the production of natural gas and electricity. And we see that being significantly important in the impact that humans have had on the environment. Guys, the world emits about 48% more carbon dioxide from the consumption of energy now than it did in 1992. And so we're talking about a significant impact in the amount of gases that are produced by humans since 1992. And that large percent has had a huge impact on the average temperatures on the Earth. So guys, we've looked at human impact in terms of climate change. We know that the enhanced greenhouse effect is something that humans have engineered. when I say engineered, I mean it is by the fact that they've carried out various technologically advanced processes coming from the industries. And this has significantly impacted the average temperatures on Earth. And this has affected our weather patterns, our rain, our drought, as well as the harsh weather conditions we see erratically occurring on Earth. So guys, that's a wrap for this segment. Let's have a little break, and when we get back, we will look at more concepts and try and apply our understanding to that. Have a break, and we'll see you in a little bit. Welcome back, life science learners. Let's continue with our lesson. We are revising human impact on the environment today. Let's continue with looking at how we apply our understanding to the concepts around human impact on the environment. Earlier on, we looked at human impact on the atmosphere, and so we looked at the greenhouse effect, and we looked at the enhanced greenhouse effect in terms of the gases that have contributed to an increased average temperature on the Earth. Let's try and have some data around that and interpret what has happened in terms of the greenhouse gases and the effects that has had on the environment. So, here's a question, and we'll go through the question together, and then we will look at some of the questions based on this. An investigation to measure ozone concentration and the chlorine levels has been done in the Antarctica since 1950, and the results are shown in the graph on the next slide. So obviously, guys, concerns around the human impact on the environment hasn't just suddenly become an event in trying to monitor. There's been environmentalists that have been tracking this since early on, even before the 1950s. There was a lot of concern around the impact and the impact that humans were having on the environment. So we had naturalists, we had people that were in the field trying to capture data around what was the atmosphere and progressively looked at change. And so this concern hasn't been something that has suddenly been something that we have picked up in the last few decades. Okay, so let's look at the data that was collected. So guys, the graph shows you basically the information that was collected from the 1950s all the way till 1990. We have on the one set of the y-axis, we have the chlorine levels, and that's measured in pp, parts per volume, and that we'll refer to that as a unit. And then we have the ozone concentration, which is measured in an arbitrary unit there. And so we've got the ozone concentration here, and we've got the chlorine levels. And so the ozone concentration is indicated using the dashed lines, and the chlorine concentration is used indicating the solid line. And so guys, it's important that when you look at a graph, it's first to identify what is being illustrated, and then to try and see what the relationship is. It's important that you have a thorough understanding of, if you see a trend in that graph, that you understand and try and link the correlationship. So let's try and do that before we get into the questions. And so in this graph, you can clearly see that it's data that has been captured over a period of time, and we are looking at the comparison of the chlorine levels to the ozone levels. And so guys, if you do look at this, there's a general trend, and that trend shows you an increase in the chlorine concentration, and that is followed simultaneously with a decrease in the ozone concentration. So there is a relationship where you see one level increasing and then the other decreasing. And there's a scientific term that we use to describe that, and I'll get to that in a bit. Okay, so let's look at the questions based on this. So the first question, give a correct heading for the graph. Guys, it's important that when you label a graph or when you label a table, that you clearly state what the independent and dependent variables are. And in this case, we know that looking at this, we're obviously tracking levels over a period of time, and we're looking at chlorine as well as ozone levels. So let's try and put that into a decent heading that when someone reads that heading will have an indication of what the graph is actually depicting or illustrating. So let's try and put that together. As I mentioned, we're identifying that it's the independent variable is the level over a period of time, and the dependent variables are the chlorine levels as well as the ozone concentration. So how do we string that together into a decent heading? Now I would use, so it'll be a graph showing, let me just write that down for you guys. So it'll be a graph showing the, now we're getting the dependent variables, so the chlorine levels, and that's important, and the ozone concentration, and that's the other dependent variable, which we need to recognize. And this is shown over a period of time. So it's graph showing the chlorine level and the ozone concentration from 1950 all the way till 1990. Now guys, for a 2-mark question, as I mentioned, you've got to have both the independent variable, which is the time period, as well as the dependent variable, which is the chlorine levels and the ozone concentration. So it's important that you do recognize that there are 2 dependent variables in this graph. Okay, let's move on to 1.2. What is the relationship between the levels of chlorine and the concentration of ozone? Now guys, as I mentioned earlier on, if we are looking at this relationship, I'm just going to change the color of my pen. I'm going to probably use, let's see if I can use yellow and how that looks. Okay, so here we're seeing the chlorine concentration increasing, and we can see that on the other graph, the ozone concentration decreasing. So what is this relationship when one variable increases and the other decreases? Yes, think about that. So it's an opposite relationship, and the better word to use that would be an inverse relationship. We can say that, what do I mean by that? It's inversely proportional. So it's inversely proportionate. And that essentially says that when one level increases, the other level decreases. And so this is important for us to be able to recognize as a concept when interpreting graphs. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Name the dependent variable or variables in the investigation. And now that we've given the graph a heading and I've helped you to identify the dependent variables, I think it would be very easy for you to be able to do that. Let's look at the mark allocation. Guys, it's a 2-mark question. So it's possible that the examiner is hinting that there probably are 2 facts or 2 points that need to be recognized. Yes, so we know that the dependent variable is only on the y-axis. And this is a little trick that I often help my learners to remember, the difference between the independent and dependent variable. So watch this space. I'm going to try and use a different color. So let's write down the letter I. I stands for independent variable. So where does that go? That goes on the x-axis. Let's write down the first letter of the dependent variable, D. Where does that go? Yes, it goes on the y-axis. So if you're ever confused about which of these axes represents the independent and dependent variable, write down the capital letter I, and that should help you to establish the x-axis. So it means that on the x-axis you have the independent variable, and then dependent variable on the y-axis. So that's a simple way that if you're ever confused and if you're doubting yourself, that's the best way to remember that. So if you do look at this, our dependent variables are the chlorine level as well as the ozone concentration. Well done to those of you that got that. Let's move on to the next question. 1.4. In which 10-year period was the ozone depletion the greatest? So guys, again, this graph illustrates the process of data collected over a period of time. The researchers are trying to establish during which 10-year period was the depletion the greatest. Now guys, it's pointing to the ozone. So we've got to make sure that we interpret the correct graph. So let's identify. So that's what we're looking at. Okay. The next part of the question is depletion. So depletion, again, another word for depletion would be a decrease. So when was the decrease the most? And that we need to identify in a 10-year period. So guys, remember that the gradient or the slope, the steeper the slope, the more significant the decrease. So essentially, what I'm going to point to is that if we were to compare these two lines, I would say that this is a more subtle decrease or a slower decrease, whereas this is a more drastic decrease. So we see a quick decrease, and that's essentially what's going to help us. So yes, we do see a general decrease, but there is a key that we need to identify in that there is a significant decrease in this slope, meaning it's much steeper, and that's between 1970 and 1980. Let's move on to the next question. In 1987, the Montreal Protocol was signed to lay down targets to reduce the use of CFCs by countries. And so this was a standard world agreement between several countries that they would undertake a necessary conscious approach to reducing their global emissions or the emissions of CFCs and other gases. And the idea was that if each country had reduced their production of CFCs and other greenhouse gases, this would collectively, as a world collective, reduce the impact that humans as one would have on the environment. However, well, let's see. Give two reasons why, despite a reduction in the use of CFCs, there was still a decline in the ozone layer. So guys, back in the day when in the 1970s and 80s, there was a serious concern around how large, how extensive the damage to the ozone layer was. And what was noticed is that the size of the ozone hole, there was holes in that were developing, and this started to increase. And there was more harsher radiation coming in from the sun. And so the idea behind that was if we reduce the global emissions of ozone, we would eventually be able to reduce the impact that it was having on the ozone layer. And so we're talking about CFCs being reduced. However, they realized that by reducing it, the impact was not immediate. And so the reason behind this was obviously several. One of the reasons was that the countries that had undertaken to do that had not fully committed, so they were still producing significant amounts of ozone. Another reason was that there was obviously the decay of the CFCs in the atmosphere was significantly slower than expected, meaning that there was large amounts of CFCs still in the environment. And so that to degrade and to lose its potency took much longer for the CFCs to actually denature until a point when the impact that it was having was effectively seen. So before we wrap the segment up, name one item that humans were using which contains CFCs. So guys, there are many different apparatus, refrigerant, coolers, or industries that use chlorofluorocarbons. So we know that it was used extensively in air conditioning, it was used in coolants in fridges, it was also used in the production of polystyrene or thermocol. And so all of those substances or industries that produced CFCs were significantly impacting on the environment back in the day. Okay. And finally, explain why the ozone layer is important for humans. And guys, as we unpack that, the ozone layer is an important layer that prevents the harmful radiation, the ultraviolet radiation that comes through the radiant energy from the sun. And it's able to filter that out and cut out the harsh UV radiation. And so we see that that plays an important role in reducing the UV radiation that humans are exposed to. So that's an important filter that we discuss. Welcome back, life science learners. In our lesson today, we're revising human impact on the environment. It's important that we again overview some of the main concepts, and then try and apply that using that knowledge to answer some questions. Let's get straight into the lesson and review some concepts and then attempt to answer some questions. It's important that when we look at revision questions that we, oh no. Okay. Yeah, there was a pause. We can start from the board. I don't know what happened here. Didn't select the pen. Okay. So we, on that pause, James, we can. Let me just change the pen. Did I do something? I didn't. Yeah.
He didn't write on it because.
No, I didn't. Human impact. So that's where we're going to get to. That's the slide that I want to get to. Yeah. No, that's when we do our outro and intro. Okay. So let's look at some revision questions. As I mentioned, it's important that we obviously review some concepts. Let's get straight to those concepts. So we're going to talk about food security. What does that mean? And food security essentially often refers to the availability and access that individuals in a population have to food. We talk about the availability of food, its affordability, as well as its accessibility. So how accessible is food? So it's good to have food, but if that food is not being able to be accessed by people, it's also an indication of food insecurity. So those are concepts that we need to recollect. We also talk about the human exponential growth, and in terms of what has that meant in terms of the availability of food, space, resources, and the impact on the environment. Okay? Monoculture as an impact on the environment in terms of where farmers are growing specifically a type of crop, and that's again due to the pressure and demands of being able to supply an increasing human population need. What are invasive plants and how the cultivation of plants from different areas has led to invasive species impacting indigenous species of plants. The gene pool and the impact that invasive plants have on gene pool, and the importance of seed banks as being facilities that are able to store seeds in the event that we have a global crisis where a species of plants are affected. And we know that these are important facilities that ensure that the sustainability of our current plant species can be maintained in the future, should there be a world crisis around a plant's existence. Right. And so what is food security as an overview, guys? It's important that we understand that food security exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets the dietary needs and the food preferences for an active and healthy lifestyle. And this was obviously something that was agreed on by the World Committee on World Food Security. And guys, it's important that, as I mentioned, that food needs to be nutritious. You need to have a specific dietary requirement that fulfills the needs of humans. And so having food is important, but as I mentioned, it's the quality, the accessibility, and the nutritional value of food is important. So while households are often described as either food secure or insecure, there are 4 levels of food security that describes the range of households in terms of experiencing and accessing enough food. Households with high food securities and marginal food securities make up the food secure category. So we have 4 levels. So we've got the upper 2, which have a good access or high access to them, and we've got those that have moderate or marginal access to food security. However, there are households with low food security and also with very low food security that make up the food insecure categories. And I've illustrated that in this. So these are the 2 levels that are significantly safe. However, these 2 are the levels that are of concern. And we find that these often form a significant proportion of the populations around many countries in the world that are affected by famine, drought, as well as conditions in the environment as a result of human impact. So again, we've got to look at that as a factor. It's important that we understand what the human growth has been over the last few centuries. We know that the population has significantly changed over the last 50 years, and that radical increase is noted here. And so we talk about the world population radically increasing in the last 100, 150 years. And that's predominantly due to improved healthcare systems, improved mechanization, more access to food and medical care, and that has all led to an increase in the global population. However, it's important that we look at our current food production, and that is indicated on the blue line. And that blue line shows you that our current food production has, yes, drastically increased, and that's due to the advancement of technology, due to the access of more farming methods that are more sustainable. However, a concern is that it is projected that our future food needs are significantly out of sync with our current food production. And this creates a concern, meaning that our current production of food will not be able to sustain the future demands of the population. And so that's a significant concern in terms of food security for the future. So the human population has grown significantly since 1750. And as I mentioned, there's about 800 million to 2.5 billion by 1950. By 1985, it had doubled to 5 billion, and then we saw that it's currently around 7.2 billion. And so that can be illustrated as a significant increase in a short span of time, and that is what we refer to as an exponential growth. It is estimated that the human population will reach about 9.1 billion by the year 2050. So that is a concern in terms of our access to food and sustaining healthy nutritional requirements. This continued exponential increase in the world population puts more pressure on our basic resources for food production. It is predicted that the demand for food will increase by 70% by the year 2050. The challenge faced by the agricultural sector is not only to produce 70% more food, but also to make 70% more food accessible. So guys, the production of food is important, but being able to make that food accessible to an increasing global population is a concern. We do know that the environment plays a significant role in how we're able to produce that food. So let's consider those factors when we talk about food security for the future. So guys, on that note, let's have a little break. I trust that you'll grab a little snack, and when we get back, let's take some questions on this concept. Have a little break, and I'll see you in a bit. Welcome back, life science learners. Let's continue with our revision lesson on human impact. We've been looking at some concepts. Let's get straight into more concepts and try and apply those concepts in the context of different questions. As I mentioned, the best way to do that in a revision lesson is to apply your understanding in relation to different questions. And I hope that you guys take some of this and apply that when you're looking at revising any concept in life sciences. So let's get and look at in the last segment what we're looking at. So guys, we've just discussed food security. We're going to spend some time looking at biodiversity and then apply our understanding to various different questions that test our basic concepts. So it's important that we, again, in this segment, look at some keywords relevant to this part of the lesson where we're talking about biodiversity. We've mentioned how South Africa is a diverse country in terms of the diversity of plants, people, and animals. And so that concept is an important concept for us to unpack and go and look at the different biomes, look at our hotspots, look at our endemic species. And those are important to understanding the complexities of biodiversity. It's important that we also recognize solid waste as a component to human impact. and how that solid waste is contributing to the impact on the environment, and mechanisms to manage disposal of solid waste. The concept of biodegradable refers to waste that can be degraded naturally. I mentioned the term indigenous species, or plants that grow naturally in a specific area. The concept of non-biodegradable waste products, things that do not degrade, and hence our conscious approach to recycling these and disposing them off in a sustainable manner. What are hazardous waste? And so we talk about in a country where there's significant industrialization as well as mines, and the impact that the hazardous waste products produced from these industries have on the environment. We must recognize those as well. The concept of what is an exotic species, alien invasive species, and their impact on the environment needs to be considered. Poaching, which is relevant to South Africa in terms of knowing that poaching has affected many indigenous species, and the demand for international trade of these poached either rhino horns or abalone, for example. Monoculture to sustain human needs, the impact that deforestation has, as well as I mentioned earlier on, the disposal of hazardous waste. So, as a recap, what is biodiversity? As I mentioned, it refers to the variety of plants and animal species on Earth, and we know that biodiversity ensures that we have food, fresh water, medicines, fuel that we can obtain from the environment. It is also ensures that the climate is regulated, floods are controlled through our wetlands, disease are kept in check, and that's through predators eating sick and decaying animals, as well as the water is being purified and filtered in our wetlands. So guys, it's important that we consider that the complexity of biodiversity being a key factor to maintaining life and sustaining life on Earth. Biodiversity ensures that seeds are dispersed, guys. We talk about those seeds being an important part of ensuring that there's more crop and more plants available. We also know that nutrients are recycled. So example, the nitrogen cycle and the carbon cycle, and how biodiversity, how the impact of biodiversity affects these cycles. The oxygen and soil are also affected by a loss or damage to the biodiversity. It also helps to improve the quality of life by providing us with forms of recreation and ecotourism. And we look at human impact on the environment and how that affects our local tourism industry. We also know that we admire and we appreciate the nature that we have. And so if we remove that, you find that that also affects the quality of life of individuals. So guys, a few more concepts around soil generation and soil quality. We talk about the quality of air, the water quality. An important concept in our environment is controlling pest and invasive plant species. The concept around pollination and crop production, and how if we remove or if we affect our diversity of life forms, we in turn can affect how plants are pollinated and in turn decrease our crop production. Prevention and natural disasters. So we talk about natural disasters such as tsunamis, droughts, heavy rainfalls. And so those are natural disasters which often are an impact that often happen as an impact of humans on the environment. Climate stabilization and the provision of food security are important concepts. We also will have an overview of farming methods, the concept around monoculture, overgrazing, and the impact that golf estates have on biodiversity. Mining is a significant industry that has provided lots of revenue to a country such as South Africa. However, we got to look at sustainable mining and the impact that mining has had on the environment. We talk about urbanization and how that affects biodiversity, deforestation, and how that has affected the quality of land and has led to landslides. It's led to arid, uninhabitable land. We talk about the loss of wetlands and grasslands, and wetlands are an important a part of an environment that helps to purify water. poaching, we discussed that, and alien plant invasion. So what is waste? Waste is also known as rubbish, trash, refuse, garbage, junk, litter, and so forth. And it is unwanted or useless material that is often discarded, thrown away, or irresponsibly dumped. And so that again contributes to what we refer to as landfills. It often impacts on the quality of our environment. So in biology, waste is any of the many unwanted substances or toxins that are expelled from living organisms from metabolic waste such as urea and sweat. So we do know that as metabolic processes, we do produce lots of waste. Let's look at different types of waste and how these are categorized. So we have organic waste, and organic waste again points to waste that can degrade or it's degradable. We also have hazardous waste, and again hazardous waste will point to waste that is produced that can affect the quality of the environment as well as other living forms in the environment. We have solid waste, which is waste that is probably non-biodegradable. So we talk about glass, we talk about things that cannot be broken down any further. So that's solid waste. We also have liquid waste. So we talk about from mines, when we talk about acid drain-offs, or in industries that produce lots of waste products that flow into rivers, that's again liquid waste. And then we talk about recyclable waste, and these are waste products that like paper that can be recycled, plastic that can be recycled. So recyclable waste would be paper, plastic, things that can be regenerated and repurposed for different uses. Okay, as I mentioned, we'll very quickly overview the different types of waste. Solid waste, as I mentioned, these are solid forms of domestic, commercial, and industrial waste. Examples of these solid waste include plastic, styrofoam, which is your polystyrene containers, your bottles, plus plastic and glass, cans, your aluminum cans, paper, scrap iron, and other trash form part of your solid waste. Your liquid waste would include liquid from, example, your domestic waste, so when you obviously washing your dishes, chemicals from industries that use chemicals that are now effluents, oil spills, as well as oils from certain industries where there's a lot of mechanization, wastewater from ponds, manufacturing industries, and other sources contribute significant amounts of liquid waste into the environment. Gaseous waste would be waste products in the form of gases. Examples of these would be the waste that is produced from our fossil fuel industries. So we talk about methane, carbon dioxide, and sulfur dioxide, and these are significantly affecting our greenhouse gases. We also know that we can classify waste according to the origin and type. So we have municipal solid waste, we have biomedical solid waste. So currently we're looking at all the waste products that are produced in hospitals and facilities where there is human tissues or samplings and testing done. So those are biomedical waste products. Often the concern around infection and pathogens and germs are in those. Industrial waste again would be waste produced by industries. Agricultural waste, again waste produced from farming, as well as your fishery waste, so waste produced from the fishing industry where there's lots of disposal of remnants of fish that are processed. So if you talk of your canning industry, what happens to the internal organs and the extra fins and how that is disposed of. Radioactive waste, and we talk about nuclear power stations and how they produce radioactive waste and how that is disposed of correctly. And then your electronic waste, guys. So this is again a concern, a growing concern in around the world, especially with the development of technology and electronic devices. What happens to your old laptops? What happens to your old cell phones, your desktops? How are those disposed of? And so we find that that's your growing concern in the future. Right. So we can also classify waste according to their properties. And as I mentioned earlier on, we can broadly classify them into two groups, your biodegradable and your non-biodegradable waste. And so when we talk about biodegradable, again, these can be degraded or broken down. Example of this would be your paper, wood, fruit peels, and others. So things that will naturally decompose in the environment are biodegradable. However, we have the other category in which cannot be degraded naturally. So this would be plastic bottles and cans, old machines, styrofoam containers, and other substances that cannot naturally break down in the environment. Okay, so guys, it's important that we do recognize that waste have a significant impact on the environment. We need to take a conscious decision as to how we reduce the waste production, firstly, and second, how we dispose of the waste. So being able to separate our waste into recyclable and non-recyclable is important. We also must remember the golden rule of reduce, reuse, and recycle. And that often helps in reducing the amount of waste products that are produced. Right. So guys, we're going to get on to one question before we wrap this segment up. So this question is adapted from a paper in March. It shows a table with different types of waste and their decomposition times. So we've got different types of waste that have been indicated down this column, and we've got the decomposition times of these waste. It's important that you recognize how long it takes for some of these waste products to decompose or degrade. And so that's a concern. An example would be glass takes about 1 million years to decompose. And if we compare that to orange peels, that takes 6 months. So that, again, that's important information when we refer to biodegradable and non-degradable waste products. Okay, so let's look at the first question based on this set of data. Explain the term recycling. And guys, we've often used the term recycling. It's a simple question. So recycling is a process of converting waste materials into reusable objects to prevent waste of potentially useful materials. So when we take certain substances and we repurpose them, that's recycling them. We also reduce the consumption of fresh raw materials. So instead of us using fresh raw materials, we can recycle some of our other waste products and repurpose them. We talk about energy usage. We talk about air pollution from incineration and water pollution from landfills by decreasing the need for conventional waste disposal. So there are many ways in which recycling can happen. It's not simply just taking paper and repurposing it. Even in industries, the fact that, bottles are recycled and repurposed, rubber is recycled and repurposed. That's all part of initiatives to reduce, one, the waste disposable stuff, as well as to increase the use of raw materials by repurposing them. Right. Name one type of waste in the table above that can be recycled. So guys, when we look at the waste in the table above, we got to know that recycling essentially means reusing them. So if we were to quickly wrap this up, we can see that paper can be recycled, aluminum cans can be recycled, as well as your tin cans can be recycled. So guys, we've looked at human impact on the environment. We've looked at various different components and the core concepts. We kind of wrapped up this segment by looking at how to recycle and reduce the waste that we produce. It's important that as you revise this entire section that you look at the 4 different concepts that we looked at. We looked at human impact on the environment in terms of the atmosphere. We looked at, finally in the last segment, we've looked at waste products. We've also spoke about the human population impacting on the food crisis that we have. And those are the important concepts that we need to look at. I trust that you've enjoyed the lesson and that you can go back and reflect on what we've done. Thank you for being an amazing audience. Take care, go well, and have a baie lekker day. Cheers.